Welcome, dear readers, to a journey that will take us through the ancient stones of Erlangen Castle, where the winter of 1878 held secrets that only the heart could unveil. This is a story about how love can flourish in the most unexpected places, how simplicity can heal deep wounds, and how a young French orphan brought spring to a castle plunged into the coldest of emotional winters. Prepare to meet Marie Dubois, a cook who carried much more than recipes in her hands. She brought hope. Follow the transformation of a widowed prince and his twin children, lost in the silence of grief, until they found again the music of life. Before we begin this sensory journey through the frozen corridors and perfumed kitchens of Erlangen, tell me, from what corner of this vast world are you watching us? Leave in the comments the city from where you accompany us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us continue bringing these stories that warm the soul. Year: 1878. Location: Erlangen Castle, European Principality. Winter had come early to Erlangen that year of 1878, as if the very sky conspired to mirror the melancholy that had settled in the majestic castle. Between the grey stone towers that pierced the leaden horizon, a sepulchral silence reigned, where once children's laughter and lullabies had echoed. In the main hall, under the stern gaze of ancestral portraits, two small figures remained motionless, like marble statues. Heinrich and Greta, 6-year-old twins, sat in chairs too tall for their small bodies, their feet swinging in the void, like pendulums stopped in time. Their eyes, once bright as winter stars, now seemed like windows closed to the world. Prince Friedrich von Erlangen walked through the corridors like a ghost in his own home. At 34, his brown hair was already beginning to grey at the temples, not from age, but from the anguish that had been corroding his soul since Margaret departed. His wife, delicate as a white rose, had bid farewell to the world one September morning, taking with her not only her own breath of life, but also the voices of her children. The doctors from Vienna had failed. The pedagogues from Berlin, with their modern theories and scientific methods, returned to their universities empty-handed. The children simply existed. They breathed, but did not live. They ate only what was necessary to not perish, moved like automatons, and their mouths remained sealed like tombs. In the main kitchen, Mrs. Müller, the housekeeper with a stern face and silver hair pulled into a tight bun, watched with growing concern the trays that returned untouched. The aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg, that once attracted the little ones like enchantment, now dissipated in the cold air, without awakening any interest. "Your Excellency," she murmured to the prince on a particularly icy afternoon, when snowflakes began to cover the gardens with a white mantle. "The Countess of Villeneuve sent a letter. She recommends a young Frenchwoman, a cook who, they say, possesses special gifts with children." Friedrich stopped before the window that faced the inner courtyard, where a frozen fountain reflected the grey sky like a broken mirror. "Special gifts?" he repeated, his voice echoing hollow between the stone walls. "They say she was raised in a convent in Marseille. Orphaned since childhood, she learned to cook with the nuns. There are stories—" the housekeeper hesitated, "stories that her food awakens memories and cures melancholies." The prince closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, like a lead cape. What harm could there be in trying once more? His children were already lost to him. Perhaps a stranger could find them where he had failed. What secrets would a simple French cook hide, and would she be capable of breaking the silence that imprisoned two small hearts? November brought with it a modest carriage that dragged along the cobblestone road like a shadow against the snowy landscape. Marie Dubois pressed against her chest a worn leather suitcase, her slender fingers trembling, not only from the cutting cold that penetrated through the carriage's cracks, but from the anxiety that churned her stomach. At 23, Marie carried in her dark eyes the melancholic wisdom of one who had known from early on the loneliness of orphanages. Her face, delicate as French porcelain, framed by brown hair that escaped under a simple bonnet, reflected a silent dignity that no adversity had managed to shake. When the carriage stopped before the castle's service entrance, Marie could hear the distrustful murmur of the servants. Her French accent, soft as wild honey, seemed to sound like foreign music to ears accustomed to the local dialect. "Another Frenchwoman," whispered one of the chambermaids, watching her from the pantry window, "as if we didn't have enough problems already." Mrs. Muller received her with the cold courtesy reserved for temporary employees. She led Marie through corridors that smelled of beeswax and ancient woods, to a tiny room located at the back of the secondary kitchen. The chamber, no larger than a convent cell, had only a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a small window that faced the stable courtyard. "Your duties," said the housekeeper, with a voice cutting like an icy blade, "are limited to preparing special meals for the young masters. You must not address the prince without being asked. You must not circulate through the north wing without authorization. And you certainly must not approach the children outside the context of meals." Marie nodded in silence, her small hands smoothing the clean apron she had brought with her. She knew well the hierarchies of palaces. She had worked before in the House of Nobles in Lyon, where she had learned that discretion was the most valuable virtue of a servant. That first night, while winds howled through the cracks of Gothic windows like wandering souls, Marie discreetly explored her new kitchen. The wood-burning stove still conserved warm embers, and well-organized pantries stored spices she hadn't seen since leaving France. Ceylon cinnamon, Madagascar vanilla, brown sugar that smelled like wet earth. It was then that she heard small footsteps in the corridor. Peeping through the door's crack, she saw two tiny figures walking like shadows through the penumbra. Heinrich and Greta moved like sleepwalkers, holding hands, their white nightgowns undulating like childish ghosts in the poorly lit corridor. Marie felt her heart tighten with an old and familiar pain. She knew that lost look, that loneliness that seemed too big for such small bodies. It was the same look she saw in the mirror when she was a child and the other girls in the orphanage slept, leaving her alone with her silent tears. In that moment, Marie knew it wasn't just about a job. It was a calling that echoed from the depths of her maternal soul, even though she had never given birth to a life. Some women were born to be mothers to their own children, others to mother the orphaned hearts that life placed in their path. But how could a simple cook reach two small hearts locked behind invisible walls of pain? Night enveloped the castle like a black velvet mantle, and only the crackling of fireplaces broke the silence that weighed over the corridors like an unspoken prayer. Marie remained awake in her small room, listening to the familiar sounds of a sleeping palace, the shuffling of slippers over cold stone, the distant tinkling of chains in the wind, the sighing of ancient woods that kept centuries of secrets. When the tower clock struck midnight, she rose silently. Her hands, which had learned the secrets of French cooking in the cold cells of the Marseille convent, began to work with the precision of a prayer. She chose apples that still held the perfume of autumn orchards, butter golden as captured sunbeams in ceramic pots, sugar that dissolved between her fingers like sweet tears. The dough grew under her palms like a promise, and the aroma of cinnamon awakened memories of Sunday afternoons when the sisters allowed the orphans to help in the kitchen. The tarte tatin took shape slowly, each of Marie's gestures loaded with an intention that transcended simple cooking. While the golden apples caramelized in the oven, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer learned in childhood. May this food bring comfort to whoever feeds from it. At dawn, when the first rays of sun filtered through windows fogged by ice, Marie placed the still warm tart on a silver tray. Without a sound, she walked through the corridors to the north wing, where she knew the children took their silent breakfast. She left the tray on a table near the window that faced the frozen garden, beside two small chairs where Heinrich and Greta used to sit to observe the birds that no longer sang. She didn't say a word, made no gesture to draw attention. She simply left the sweet there like a silent offering and withdrew. Hidden behind a marble column, she watched when the twins came down for breakfast. They came as they always came, holding hands, small and hesitant steps over the Persian rug that muffled their movements. They stopped before the table, their blue eyes fixing on the golden tart as if it were an object fallen from another world. It was Greta who first extended her hand. Her tiny fingers touched the still warm crust, and Marie saw something move in her face, an almost imperceptible tremor, like a stone thrown on the surface of a still lake. The girl brought a small piece to her lips, chewed slowly, and then it happened. A tear rolled down her rosy face, followed by another and another, as if a dam had broken in her small chest. Heinrich touched his sister's face with the curiosity of one who rediscovers a lost world. And then he too tasted the tart. There were no words. There were no screams or celebrations. just two children crying silently while eating, as if each bite brought back a part of their souls that had been lost along with their mother. Marie withdrew without making noise, her heart beating like a war drum in her chest. She didn't yet know that this small miracle would echo through the castle corridors like a whispered secret, reaching the ears of a desperate prince. Would this be the first step of a journey that would transform not only two wounded children, but an entire kingdom imprisoned in melancholy? The news spread through the castle with the speed of the icy wind that swept the snow-covered courtyards. "The children ate," whispered the chambermaids while polishing the silverware. "They ate and cried," murmured the footmen while lighting the fireplaces. "The Frenchwoman did something," speculated the cooks between the clinking of utensils. Prince Friedrich learned of the news while still wearing his nightgown, brought by a page with eyes wide as if he had witnessed a miracle. He wasted no time with formalities. He immediately went down to the kitchen, his bare feet echoing over the cold marble of the service stairs. He found Marie preparing a soup whose aroma rose in golden spirals through the morning air. She didn't raise her eyes when he entered, continuing to stir the cauldron with rhythmic and hypnotic movements, as if she were weaving a liquid enchantment. "It was you," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. His voice, hoarse with contained emotion, seemed to echo on the stone walls like a distant echo. Marie finally raised her gaze. Her dark eyes met his, blue as winter sky, and for a moment time seemed suspended between them like snowflakes that hesitate before touching the ground. "Your Excellency," she murmured, making a discreet curtsy without dropping the wooden spoon. "I merely cooked." "For 3 months," said Friedrich, approaching until he could feel the perfumed steam from the soup. "My children have shown no interest in food. Yesterday they ate your tart and cried. For the first time since they lost their mother, they cried." Marie lowered her eyes again, concentrating on the soup that bubbled gently. "Tears are sometimes the first step toward healing, Your Excellency. The convent sisters taught me that food made with love carries more than flavor. It carries memories, comforts, hopes." Friedrich observed her in silence, noticing how her small hands moved with sacred precision, how her brown hair escaped from the bonnet and framed her concentrated face. There was something about her that awakened a strange sensation in his chest, not just gratitude, but a curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. "Continue," he said simply. "Do whatever you think necessary. You have my authorization to prepare the children's meals as you see fit." When he withdrew, Marie felt her legs tremble slightly. It wasn't just the prince's presence that had affected her, but something in his eyes, a vulnerability that hid behind authority, a pain that echoed her own loneliness. That afternoon she prepared warm bread with poppy seeds and a golden pumpkin soup with ginger. When Heinrich and Greta came down for lunch, she was again hidden, watching. This time they didn't just eat. Greta whispered something to Heinrich, and for the first time in months, their lips sketched something that resembled a smile. But not everyone in the castle celebrated these small progressions. Mrs. Muller watched Marie with growing suspicion, and the whispers in the corridors began to take less favorable tones. "French influence," some murmured. "Strange methods," others whispered. Marie felt the hostile looks like icy blades against her back, but continued her silent work. She knew that winning the trust of two wounded children was just the beginning. There was an entire castle of lost souls waiting for a pinch of hope. The question was, how much time would she have before the forces of tradition and prejudice turned against her? The weeks followed like pages turned in an old book, each day bringing small miracles disguised as meals. Heinrich began to murmur "thank you" in French after each dish, and Greta started leaving small drawings beside the empty plates, childish flowers, houses with smoking chimneys, human figures with crooked smiles. But the winter of 1878 brought more than snow to Erlangen. It arrived one icy morning in correspondence, sealed with red wax, bearing the imperial coat of arms. Friedrich read the letter in his private chambers, and Marie, who was preparing the children's hot chocolate in the kitchen, could hear the heavy sound of something being hurled against the wall. The missive was clear. The Emperor expected the official announcement of Friedrich's engagement to Lady Katharina von Rosenthal, daughter of an influential family from Vienna. The marriage had been arranged years before, postponed only by Margaret's death. Now, with mourning considered officially ended, The court expected the prince to fulfill his political duties. Lady Katharina arrived in a golden carriage that seemed displaced in Erlangen's austere landscape. At 28, she possessed the cold beauty of marble statues, perfectly arranged blonde hair, skin white as snow, and green eyes that seemed to calculate the value of each object they rested upon. Marie first saw her during the diplomatic dinner that would precede the official announcement of the engagement. Through the slightly open kitchen door, she observed the lady seated to Friedrich's right, conversing animatedly about political reforms and commercial alliances. Her voice, educated and musical, echoed through the dining hall like crystal tinkling against crystal. "What a beautiful family we shall form," said Katharina, observing Heinrich and Greta, who ate in silence. "The children need a mother who understands their noble responsibilities, adequate education, competent tutors, preparation for their future roles in society." Friedrich nodded politely, but Marie noticed how his eyes constantly drifted to his children, as if searching for signs that they too approved of those words. It was that night that Greta fell ill, a sudden fever that left her delirious, calling for maman, between tears that wet the embroidered pillow. Heinrich sat beside his sister's bed, holding her small hand as if he could transfer his own strength to her. Mrs. Müller called the town doctor, but Marie couldn't stand still. She went up to the north wing without authorization, carrying a chamomile infusion with honey that the convent sisters used to calm feverish children. She found Friedrich beside the bed, still wearing the formal attire from dinner, holding his daughter's hand as if she might dissolve between his fingers. "Your Excellency," whispered Marie, offering the steaming cup. "It's just chamomile, but it might help her rest." Friedrich looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Lady Katharina said I need to hire an adequate governess, someone who educates the children in court manners." Marie nodded, although she felt something tighten in her chest like a rope being tensed. "Children need care, Your Excellency, whatever kind that may be." Greta moaned softly, and Marie, without asking permission, sat on the edge of the bed. She began to hum a French lullaby she had learned as a baby, before even being taken to the orphanage. Her voice, soft as warm honey, seemed to calm not only the feverish girl, but also the prince who watched her. When Greta finally fell asleep, breathing peacefully, Friedrich remained in silence for long minutes. Below, the diplomatic dinner guests still awaited his return, Lady Katharina certainly wondering where he had gone. "Marie," he said finally, his voice low as a confession, "what would you do if you had to choose between duty and heart?" The question hung in the air like incense, loaded with meanings that not even he dared to name. Marie didn't answer with words. She just looked at the sleeping child, then at Heinrich, who was also dozing in a nearby armchair, and finally at Friedrich. Some silences carry more answers than all the words in the world. But what painful choices awaited a prince divided between the obligations of power and the whispers of the heart? Dawn brought with it more than the pale light of winter. It brought Father Wilhelm and 2 members of the royal council, marching through the castle corridors with the solemnity of a funeral procession. The inspection of the children, as they diplomatically called it, had been suggested by Lady Katharina as a way to evaluate their progress and educational needs. Marie watched from the kitchen when the serious men went up to the north wing, their dark robes undulating like ravens in flight. Heinrich and Greta were conducted to the study hall, where they sat straight as little soldiers before the improvised tribunal. "Tell us about your lessons," said Father Wilhelm, his voice echoing between the dusty bookshelves. "What languages do you study? What instruments do you play? What prayers do you recite?" The children remained mute, their large eyes fixed on their intertwined hands in their laps. The absence of words weighed in the air like molten lead. "I see they haven't completely recovered yet," murmured one of the councillors, making notes in a leather notebook. "Perhaps a more traditional approach is necessary." It was then that they sent for Marie. She went down to the hall with her apron still dirty with flour, her small hands trembling slightly as she made the curtsy required by etiquette. "Mademoiselle Dubois," began Father Wilhelm, pronouncing her name with the local accent that made it sound strange to her own ears. "We've been told that the children have been eating better under your care. What methods do you use?" Marie chose her words carefully, like one walking on thin ice. "I merely cook, Reverend. Simple food, made with care." "Simple?" repeated one of the councillors, raising an eyebrow. We've heard of French spices, of unusual recipes. Food is food, Your Excellency, responded Marie with the tranquility she had learned at the convent. Good food nourishes the body and sometimes calms the spirit. And what conversations do you have with the children during meals? None, Reverend. They eat in silence. But there is influence, insisted the priest, leaning forward. Influence of what nature exactly? What kind of education did you receive? What books did you read? What French ideas did you bring with you? Marie felt the weight of decades of prejudice and distrust descending on her shoulders like a wet cape. She knew well that inquisitive tone. She had heard similar when young nuns questioned the orphans about dreams considered improper, about laughter considered too loud, about tears considered unnecessary. I was raised by the Sisters of Charity, Reverend. I learned to read with the catechism, to write copying psalms, to cook to feed the hungry. I brought no ideas. I brought only hands and the will to serve. The interrogation continued for another hour, each question sharper than the last. They questioned her faith, her methods, her intentions. They suggested that perhaps it would be better to hire a German governess, someone who understood local traditions, who wouldn't bring cultural complications. When they finally released her, Marie felt like a bird that had flown against a storm and survived by miracle. Upon leaving the hall, however, she heard Friedrich conversing with the councillors. The children are better, he said, his voice firm as rock. For the first time in months, they eat, sleep, show signs of life. If this is the result of Marie's work, then she stays. But Your Excellency, protested the priest, considering your future marriage, perhaps Lady Katharina would prefer a more— Lady Katharina may have her preferences, interrupted Friedrich, and Marie perceived a new coldness in his voice. But while I am the father of these children, they remain under the care of whoever has proven capable of helping them. Later, when Marie was preparing dinner, Heinrich appeared at the kitchen door. It was the first time one of the children had voluntarily sought her out. He said nothing, just extended a sheet of paper where he had drawn a woman in an apron next to two smiling children. In the drawing, they were all holding hands. But how much longer could they keep those hands united against the forces that aligned to separate them? December wrapped Erlangen in a shroud of snow and whispers. In the town that extended at the foot of the castle, between the wooden and stone houses that exhaled smoke through their chimneys, conversations always revolved around the same question. What kind of spell had the French cook cast over the prince's children? Marie felt the weight of these rumors like stones in her pockets when she went down to the village to buy spices. The women in the market fell silent when she passed, resuming their conversations in whispers as soon as she moved away. Strange methods, they murmured. Undue influence, they whispered. French things, they concluded, with the ancestral distrust that Germanic peoples nurtured for their Latin neighbors. In the castle, Lady Katharina moved through the halls like an already crowned queen, rearranging furniture, suggesting changes in decoration, planning events that would consolidate her position as future princess. She observed Marie with eyes that resembled green ice, calculating and cold. Friedrich, she said one afternoon while they had tea in the blue salon, I've observed that the children have developed a worrying dependence on the cook. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to hire an adequate governess, someone who could educate them in court manners? Friedrich stirred his tea without drinking it, watching the snowflakes that danced beyond the window like restless spirits. The children are well, he responded simply. They are different, insisted Katharina, her melodious voice carrying a subtle firmness. Heinrich was seen conversing in French with the servant. Greta asked if she could learn to cook. These are not appropriate occupations for future nobles. Mrs. Muller, present at the conversation, as she always was when it came to domestic matters, nodded gravely. Lady Katharina is right, Your Excellency. The Frenchwoman has excessive influence over the young masters. That same week, Katharina organized a charity event in town, a food distribution for the poor that would serve both to demonstrate her benevolence and to strengthen her public image before the official announcement of the engagement. Marie was assigned to prepare the basic baskets, working since before dawn to pack breads, preserves, and sweets that would bring relief to needy families. It was during this event that she discovered the drawing. Hidden among Greta's clothes, she found a sheet of paper where the girl had drawn a family. A tall man, a woman with brown hair and an apron, and 2 children, all smiling, all holding hands, with a house in the background that suspiciously resembled the castle kitchen. Marie held the paper with trembling hands, feeling tears prick her eyes. It was the first time she saw herself as part of a family, even if only in a 6-year-old child's imagination. But the drawing also represented danger. If the right people found it, it could be interpreted as proof that she had manipulated the children, creating inappropriate bonds that threatened the natural order of things. It was that night that the confrontation happened. Marie was going down a corridor carrying a tray with the children's dinner when she encountered Friedrich, Lady Katharina, and Mrs. Müller, conversing in low but intense tones. "The situation has become unsustainable," said Katharina, her voice cutting like broken crystal. "The children need to learn to behave like nobles, not like peasants who play in the kitchen." "And what exactly is the problem with children who finally smile?" retorted Friedrich, a new irritation coloring his voice. "The problem," interrupted Mrs. Müller, "is that they're becoming attached to the servant in an unhealthy way. Yesterday I found Heinrich trying to help her carry firewood." "A child of royal blood carrying firewood!" Marie tried to pass unnoticed, but Lady Katharina saw her. "Ah, Mademoiselle Dubois," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Precisely the person we were talking about." The silence that followed was heavy as molten lead. Marie felt the 3 pairs of eyes on her, Katharina's calculating, Mrs. Müller's accusatory, Friedrich's impossible to decipher. "I believe it would be beneficial for everyone," continued Katharina with a voice soft as poisoned silk, "if Mademoiselle Dubois considered a transfer. I have contacts in Vienna who could offer a position more suitable to her abilities." The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence, and Marie understood that the moment of truth had arrived. The forces that aligned against her had finally shown their face, and she would need to choose between fighting or fleeing. But how could a simple cook fight against the power of nobility and the force of tradition? Lady Katharina's words echoed through the castle corridors during the following days, like a whispered curse. Marie felt every glance, every whisper, every pause in conversations when she passed. The pressure grew like water dammed behind a barrier about to break. It was Mrs. Müller who came to speak to her on a cold December morning, when Marie was preparing the children's hot chocolate, with hands that trembled more from nervousness than from cold. "Girl," said the housekeeper, her voice carrying a forced gentleness that was more threatening than any scream. "You are young. You have a future ahead. You shouldn't waste your years here, involved in complications." Marie continued stirring the chocolate, watching the golden spirals that formed on the creamy surface. "I don't understand, madam." "You understand indeed," retorted Mrs. Müller, approaching until Marie could smell the scent of lavender and disapproval that emanated from her rigid clothes. "You're creating inappropriate bonds with the children. This isn't healthy for them, and it's certainly not appropriate for you." "I merely care for them," murmured Marie, her voice low as a prayer. "And Lady Katharina will care much better," said the housekeeper firmly. "She has contacts in Vienna, in Berlin. She can get you an excellent position in a respectable house, away from here, away from complications." Marie understood the message. It wasn't an invitation. It was an ultimatum politely disguised. Leave voluntarily or be removed by force. The choice of manner, not of outcome. That night, Marie walked through the castle corridors as if she were saying goodbye to each stone, each tapestry, each candle that flickered in the sconces. She had found there, for brief months, something she had never known, the feeling of being necessary, of belonging somewhere, of mattering to someone. In the first hours of dawn, when only the ghosts of memory wandered through the silent halls, she prepared one last meal: sweet bread with raisins, warm milk with honey, small star-shaped cookies that the convent sisters made at Christmas. She left everything on a tray covered with an embroidered cloth, along with a letter written in her careful handwriting. "For Heinrich and Greta, who taught me that love can flourish in the most unexpected places. Always remember that you are loved, you are special, you are capable of bringing light to the world. The tarte tatin is in the pantry. The recipe is on the back of this letter. Cook when you feel homesick, and know that somewhere someone thinks of you with affection. May God bless your paths, Marie." She packed her few possessions in the worn leather suitcase, the same one she had arrived with months before. When the morning carriage departed for the town of Lindhof, Marie was in it, watching Erlangen Castle recede through the fogged window like a dream that dissolves upon awakening. In the Lindhof bakery, where she got temporary work, Marie tried to rebuild her life like a bird tries to remake its nest after a storm. But no matter how much she kept her hands busy kneading bread and molding sweets, her mind constantly flew back to the icy corridors where two children would wake up and find only a cold tray and a letter explaining why the only person who understood them had disappeared from their lives. At Erlangen Castle, Heinrich and Greta found the letter and remained in silence for 3 days. They didn't cry, didn't protest, simply closed themselves again, like flowers that wither in winter's first cold. They refused to eat anything but bread and water, ignored the tutors that Lady Katharina hired, returned to the mutism that had characterized the first months after their mother's death. Friedrich watched his children wither again and felt something break in his chest like ice that cracks under pressure. The decision he would make that December would change not only the fate of a French cook, but the course of an entire kingdom where love had dared to challenge conventions. But would it be too late to mend what had been broken? The storm arrived at Erlangen 3 days after Marie's departure, as if the very sky protested against the injustice committed. Icy winds howled through the castle towers, shaking the windows in their frames like ghosts trying to enter. Friedrich walked through the corridors like a wounded wolf, watching his children wither again before his eyes. Heinrich and Greta had returned to their previous state, sitting like statues, refusing any food, their eyes fixed on some distant point that only they could see. The entire castle seemed to have regressed to that sepulchral silence that had preceded the French cook's arrival. It was on the morning of the 4th day that Friedrich made his decision. He found Marie's letter on the children's table, read each word with the attention of one deciphering a sacred code, and finally understood the magnitude of what he had allowed to happen. Without warning anyone, he saddled his swiftest horse and departed for Lindhof through the blinding snow and wind that cut skin like blades. The town was 2 hours' ride in normal conditions, but the storm transformed the journey into an odyssey that lasted almost half a day. He found Marie in the local bakery, her hands covered with flour, her hair escaping from the bonnet in rebellious strands that framed her tired face. She was preparing bread for the oven when the door's bell tinkled, announcing someone's entrance. She turned, expecting to see any customer, and found herself face to face with Friedrich, drenched by melted snow, his blue eyes shining with an intensity she didn't know how to interpret. "Your Excellency," she murmured, making an automatic curtsy that knocked flour from her apron. "The children don't eat," he said without preambles, his voice hoarse from riding against the wind. "For 4 days they don't eat, don't speak, don't react. They've returned to being ghosts." Marie felt her heart tighten like a closed fist. "I'm very sorry to hear it, Your Excellency. But surely Lady Katharina will find—" "Lady Katharina will find nothing," interrupted Friedrich, approaching until she could see the melted snowflakes on his eyelashes. "You need to come back." "I can't," said Marie, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wouldn't be appropriate. Rumors. Your future wife." "Marie," he said, pronouncing her name with a tenderness that made her tremble. "You brought my children back to life. You taught them to smile again, to eat, to exist in the world. How can I allow them to depart from this life without fighting for them? And your marriage?" she asked, finally daring to look directly into his eyes. Friedrich remained in silence for a long moment, the snow accumulated in his hair beginning to drip onto the bakery's wooden floor. "There are choices we make out of duty," he said finally, "and there are choices we make out of love. I've learned that living only for duty is a slow way of dying." The conversation that followed was conducted in whispers, like a confession made in the penumbra of a chapel. Friedrich offered Marie an official position as governess, with adequate salary and respectable position. He would protect her from rumors, guarantee her safety, do whatever was necessary so she could continue caring for Heinrich and Greta. "But what about Lady Katharina?" insisted Marie, although she felt hope growing in her chest like a plant that finds water after a long drought. "Lady Katharina will receive a generous dowry and a letter explaining that the engagement has been dissolved," responded Friedrich. "She is an intelligent woman. She'll understand that a man incapable of love wouldn't be a good husband." Marie looked at her flower-covered hands, then at Friedrich, who awaited her response like one awaiting a judge's verdict. She thought of the children withering in the castle, the emptiness she had left in their lives, the possibility of returning to the place where, for the first time, she had felt at home. "For the boys," she said finally, like one accepting a sacred mission. "I return for the boys." Friedrich smiled for the first time in days, a smile that transformed his face like sun breaking through heavy clouds. "For the boys," he repeated, although both knew there was much more at stake than just the welfare of two children. The journey back to Erlangen was made under a sky that slowly opened, revealing stars that seemed to twinkle in approval. Marie rode on the back of Friedrich's horse, her arms around his waist, feeling the warmth of his body through the wet coat. Would this be the beginning of a new season, not only in the calendar, but in hearts that had dared to challenge conventions in the name of love? Marie's return to Erlangen Castle caused an uproar that echoed from the stables to the highest towers. The servants whispered among themselves as they saw her dismount from Friedrich's horse, her clothes marked by the journey, but her eyes shining with a new determination. Mrs. Müller watched from the sitting-room window, her face contracted in an expression that mixed surprise, indignation, and something resembling fear. Lady Katharina received the news in her chambers, where she was finishing dressing for dinner. Her French chambermaid, coincidentally also named Marie, which had always caused confusion in the castle, announced the cook's arrival with the delicacy of one reporting a natural disaster. "Elle est revenue," murmured the chambermaid in French, momentarily forgetting to speak in German. Katharina remained motionless before the mirror for long minutes, observing her own face reflected, the perfectly arranged blonde hair, the clear skin like porcelain, the green eyes she had always considered her greatest beauty. She was a woman accustomed to winning, to getting what she wanted, through a calculated combination of charm, intelligence, and determination. The idea of being surpassed by a simple French cook seemed to her not only improbable, but fundamentally offensive to the natural order of things. The confrontation happened in the main hall, before the fireplace where the fire crackled like a restless audience. Friedrich had asked to speak with Katharina, and she came down wearing her most elegant dress, emerald green silk that enhanced her eyes, and a pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. "Katharina," began Friedrich, his voice carrying a formality she had never heard before, "I need to communicate a decision to you." "If it's about the cook," she said, sitting gracefully in a burgundy velvet armchair, "I imagine you've brought her back temporarily, until we find a more adequate solution." "No," responded Friedrich, remaining standing before the fireplace. "Marie will stay. She will receive the official position of governess to the children, with all the rights and protections that the position implies." Katharina felt something cold descend down her spine, like when a cloud passes before the sun. "And our engagement?" Friedrich looked at the flames dancing in the fireplace, as if seeking courage in the fire. "It is dissolved." The words hung in the air like crystals breaking, reflecting light in 1,000 cutting fragments. Katharina remained motionless for a moment that seemed to last eternity, processing not only the words but all their political, social, and personal implications. "For a French cook," she said finally, her voice low but loaded with icy fury. "For my children," corrected Friedrich. "For their happiness, their health, their future. And yes, for the only person who managed to return them to life." Katharina rose with measured movements, like an actress who had rehearsed the same scene 1,000 times. "You understand what this means? The alliances you'll be forced to break, the enemies you'll make, the scandal you'll cause?" "I understand," responded Friedrich, turning to face her. "And even so, it's the choice I make." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Katharina observed the man with whom she had planned to spend the rest of her life, looking for signs of the Friedrich she had known. Courteous, predictable, governed by a sense of duty. In his place, she found someone new, someone who had learned that some things were more important than political conveniences. "Very well," she said finally, her voice recovering aristocratic composure. "I'll arrange my departure for tomorrow. I hope you understand that our friendship also ends here." "I understand," said Friedrich, "and I'm genuinely sorry." Katharina made a formal curtsy, cold as a marble statue. "May you be happy with your choice, Friedrich. I hope it's worth all the price you'll pay for it." The next morning a golden carriage departed from Erlangen, carrying Lady Katharina von Rosenthal, her luggage, and her wounded dignity. Marie watched from the kitchen window when the carriage moved away down the snowy road, feeling a mixture of relief and melancholy. There was no triumph in her victory, only the silent awareness that some paths, once chosen, have no return. Mrs. Muller was removed from her position that same week, replaced by a younger and less rigid housekeeper. The change was made without drama, but with the firmness of one who had finally learned to distinguish between tradition and stubbornness. When Heinrich and Greta saw Marie in the kitchen that afternoon, preparing ginger cookies as if she had never left, they simply approached and hugged her in silence. No words were necessary. Some reunions transcend language and communicate through touch, familiar aroma, the comforting sound of a spoon beating against a bowl. But what challenges still awaited a family rebuilt on the foundations of love and the courage to break with centuries-old conventions? The winter months passed like pages written in soft tones of hope. Erlangen Castle was gradually transforming, like a garden awakening after a long hibernation. Marie settled into the governess's chambers, a comfortable set of rooms in the east wing, with a view of the gardens and close enough to the children so she could hear them if they needed her during the night. Heinrich and Greta flourished under her care, like plants that finally find the right amount of sun and water. Mornings began in the kitchen, where they learned to crack eggs without dropping shells, to stir soups without spilling, to sense when bread was ready by the aroma it exhaled. Marie taught them not only cooking, but also French, telling them stories of the convent where she had grown up, singing lullabies she had learned from the nuns. "Pourquoi les étoiles brillent?" asked Greta one February afternoon, her curious blue eyes fixed on Marie's face. "Pour nous montrer le chemin vers nos rêves," responded Marie, smiling as she taught the girl to braid bread. "To show us the way to our dreams." Heinrich, more serious than his sister, preferred learning about the greenhouse plants that Marie had begun to cultivate. Together they planted aromatic herb seeds, basil, thyme, rosemary, that would grow to season summer meals. The boy revealed himself to have magic fingers for gardening, managing to germinate seeds that others considered dead. Friedrich observed these transformations with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that he didn't dare name. Marie had become more than a governess. She was the heart that the castle lacked, the presence that transformed cold stone into a welcoming home. Their conversations became longer and more intimate, initially conducted about the children's progress, but gradually expanding to more personal themes. "Do you miss France?" he asked her one afternoon, as they walked through the gardens still covered with snow. "I miss the idea of France," responded Marie, watching how the setting sun painted the snow golden. "But I've discovered that home isn't a place. It's where we feel we belong to something greater than ourselves." Spring came early to Erlangen in 1879, as if nature itself wanted to celebrate the changes that had transformed the castle. The first flowers sprouted in March, followed by a tender green that covered the gardens like a veil of hope. Marie and the children spent entire afternoons in the garden, she teaching them the names of flowers in French, they showing her the secret hiding places they had discovered when playing with their mother. It was during one of these afternoons that Heinrich asked a question that would change everything. "Marie," he said, plucking petals from a daisy, "are you going to marry Papa?" The question hung in the air, perfumed by the wisteria that was beginning to bloom. Marie felt her face warm, not only from the unexpected question, but from the natural way Heinrich had formulated it, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Why do you ask that?" she murmured, concentrating excessively on a rose bush she was pruning. "Because you look at each other like Mama and Papa used to look," said Greta, with the disconcerting honesty of children. "And because Papa smiles again when you're around." That night, Marie remained awake looking through the window of her chambers, watching the stars that twinkled over Erlangen like ancient promises. She had found there not only a job, but a family. The family she had always dreamed of having when she was just an orphan lost between the cold walls of the convent. But did Friedrich feel the same? Could a prince really love a French cook? Or was she letting herself be carried away by the impossible dreams of a woman who had never learned to separate hope from reality? The days became longer and warmer, and with them grew in the castle a sensation that something new was about to happen, something that would forever change the destiny of all who lived between those ancient walls where love had dared to challenge the world's conventions. May painted Erlingen's gardens with all the colors that spring could gather. The rose bushes exploded in red, white, and pink flowers, while wisteria covered the pergola with lilac clusters that perfumed the air like natural incense. Marie had transformed part of the gardens into a vegetable patch where she cultivated the herbs she used in the kitchen, and Heinrich and Greta spent mornings helping her water and care for the plants. It was on one of these luminous mornings that Friedrich approached the garden carrying a wicker basket. Marie was teaching Greta to recognize when tomatoes were ripe, her hands guiding the girl's small hands with the infinite patience that characterized all her gestures. "I thought we could have a picnic," he said, his voice carrying a nervousness she had never perceived before. "The day is so beautiful, and the children have worked so hard in the garden." Marie looked at the basket, then at Friedrich, trying to decipher something in his blue eyes that seemed different that morning. "It would be wonderful," she responded, feeling butterflies dancing in her stomach. They spread a blanket under the flowering pergola, where the sweet aroma of wisteria mixed with the distant sound of birds singing in the fruit trees. Marie had prepared cucumber sandwiches, small lemon cakes, and lemonade that shone like liquid crystal in glass cups. Heinrich and Greta played nearby, building castles with small stones, while their laughter echoed through the garden like music. It was the first time since Margaret's death that the sound of childish happiness returned to bless those spaces. "Marie," said Friedrich when the children moved away to chase an orange butterfly, "there's something I need to tell you." She stopped arranging the picnic remnants and looked at him, feeling her heart accelerate. "Yes." Friedrich took her hands in his, hands calloused by work, small and delicate but strong in a way he had learned to admire. "When you arrived here, I was a man dead inside. I walked through the castle corridors like a ghost, existing without living, breathing without feeling." Marie said nothing, just watched how the light filtered through the wisteria, created patterns of light and shadow over his face. "You brought my children back to life," he continued, his voice low but firm. "But you did more than that. You brought me back too. You taught me that it's possible to love again after loss, that it's possible to be happy without bringing disrespect to the memory of those who departed." Marie felt tears prick her eyes, but didn't let them fall. "Friedrich, I love you," he said simply, the words coming out like a confession he had kept for months. "I love your gentleness, your silent strength, the way you transformed this cold house into a home full of life. I love how you cared for my children as if they were yours. I love how you taught me to smile again." The tears finally rolled down Marie's cheeks, but they were tears of joy mixed with incredulity. "And I love you too," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the murmur of wind among the leaves. "I love your kindness, your courage to choose love above convenience. I love how you are as a father, how you govern, how you make me feel important." Friedrich leaned forward and kissed her softly, a kiss that tasted of spring and fulfilled promises. When they separated, they found Heinrich and Greta watching them with enormous smiles, as if they had witnessed a miracle, which in a way was exactly what had happened. "Now are you going to be our real mother?" asked Greta, running to hug Marie. "If you want," responded Marie, hugging the girl, while Friedrich put his arm around Heinrich. "We want," said Heinrich with the seriousness of a small man. "We want very much." The sun began to set over Erlingen, painting the sky golden and pink, while a rebuilt family remained embraced under the flowering pergola. In the distance, the castle rose against the horizon like a promise that some stories, the most beautiful ones, really do end with a happy ending. Love had triumphed over convention, hope over despair, and an orphan cook from Marseille had become not only a prince's wife, but queen of a home where happiness had returned to reign as the natural right of those who dared to believe that the impossible was just a word. But would this really be the conclusion of the story, or would there still be surprises kept in the corridors of Erlingen Castle? Summer brought with it more than heat and abundant flowers to Erlingen. It also arrived in the form of a black carriage that approached the castle one June afternoon, carrying an imperial emissary whose serious face announced news that would change everything. Marie was in the kitchen preparing strawberry preserves with Heinrich and Greta when she heard the commotion in the main courtyard. The servants ran from one side to another, and she could hear Friedrich's authoritative voice giving orders for the guest chambers to be prepared immediately. "What could be happening?" murmured Greta, climbing on a chair to peek through the window. Marie felt a shiver run down her spine, a dark intuition she had learned to never ignore. Situations that required urgent guest chambers rarely brought good news. Baron von Steinbach, the Emperor's personal emissary, was a man tall and thin as a rod, with grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail around him. During that night's formal dinner, from which Marie was excluded for not having sufficient official position, he exposed the reason for his visit. "Your Excellency," he said to Friedrich, methodically cutting a piece of roasted meat, "the Emperor has been informed about the changes in your matrimonial situation." Friedrich maintained a neutral expression, although Marie, watching from the kitchen entrance, could see the tension in his shoulders. "The Emperor is always well informed." "Indeed," continued the Baron, "and he is concerned. The breaking of your engagement with Lady Katharina von Rosenthal created certain diplomatic complications. Her family has considerable influence in Vienna. Complications that can be resolved," responded Friedrich carefully. The Baron smiled without humor. "Certainly. But the Emperor also learned of rumors about a new association with a French servant." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marie felt her heart accelerate, her hands involuntarily clenching against her apron. "Marie Dubois is not a servant," said Friedrich, his voice acquiring a dangerous coldness. "She is the governess of my children." "Ah, yes," murmured the Baron, consulting a paper he removed from his pocket. "Orphan from Marseille, raised in a convent, no known family, no dowry, no social position. And, I dare add, French. And what exactly is the Emperor's concern?" The Baron leaned forward, his voice lowering to a confidential tone. "The concern, Your Excellency, is that an inadequate marriage could affect your political position. Erlingen is a small principality, but strategically important. The Emperor cannot allow it to be governed by someone whose authority is questioned due to controversial matrimonial choices." Friedrich remained silent for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass without drinking it. "And what exactly does the Emperor suggest?" "A transfer," said the Baron softly. "The French woman would be relocated to an appropriate position in another region, far from here. In exchange, a new engagement would be arranged for Your Excellency, perhaps with Lady Katharina's cousin, who is equally beautiful and suitable." Marie felt the world spin around her. It was happening again, political forces aligning to separate her from the people she loved, this time with the Empire's power behind them. "And if I refuse?" asked Friedrich. The Baron's smile became even colder. "The Emperor would be disappointed. Imperial disappointments have consequences. Erlingen could lose certain commercial privileges, certain military protections, certain autonomies. The threat wasn't subtle. Marrying Marie would mean not only social scandal, but potential political and economic ruin for the entire principality." That night, Marie found Friedrich walking alone through the gardens, under a starry sky that seemed to mock their anguish with its serene beauty. He didn't hear her approach, lost in thoughts that seemed too heavy for one man to carry. "I heard the conversation," she said quietly, making him turn. "Marie," he began, but she interrupted him. "You need to do what's best for Erlingen," she said, although each word was like a dagger in her chest. "You can't sacrifice an entire principality for me." Friedrich took her hands, kissing them as if he wanted to memorize their taste. "And would you ask me to sacrifice my heart for politics?" "If necessary," she whispered, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "If necessary." They remained there under the stars, facing the greatest dilemma of their lives: love against duty, heart against reason, personal happiness against the greater good. How does a man choose between the love of his life and the welfare of thousands of people who depend on him? And how does a woman who finally found her family accept losing it again? Dawn brought with it a thick fog that wrapped Erlingen Castle like a mantle of mystery. Marie had spent the night awake, watching through the window the gardens that were lost in the grey mist, knowing that perhaps it was the last time she would see them. Her decision was made. She would leave before Friedrich was forced to choose between her and his duty as ruler. But when she went down to the kitchen to prepare her last breakfast in that place that had become her home, she found Friedrich sitting at the rustic wooden table, still wearing the previous night's clothes, as if he too hadn't been able to sleep. "I thought you were going to leave without saying goodbye," he said, his voice loaded with exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "I couldn't," admitted Marie, busying herself preparing coffee to have something to do with her trembling hands. But it's better this way. For everyone. Is it? Asked Friedrich, standing and walking to her. For Heinrich, who yesterday asked when you would officially become our family. For Greta, who drew you in all her family portraits. For me, who finally learned what it means to be alive. Marie felt tears threaten to overflow, but kept herself concentrated on the coffee boiling on the stove. For Erlingen, she said simply. For all the families that depend on this principality. It was then that the kitchen door opened, and Heinrich and Greta entered running, still in their nightgowns, followed by a man Marie had never seen, tall, elegant, with greying hair and kind eyes that contrasted dramatically with Baron von Steinbach's severity. "Papa!" exclaimed Greta, running to Friedrich's arms. "The gentleman said he had a surprise for us." The unknown man smiled, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "Prince Friedrich," he said, "I apologize for the morning visit. I am Count von Habsburg, personal counselor to His Imperial Majesty." Marie felt her blood freeze in her veins. Another emissary, this time of even higher rank. "Your Excellency," murmured Friedrich, making a formal bow. "To what do I owe the honor?" The Count looked around the kitchen, at Marie with her simple apron, at the children clinging to their father's legs, at the homemade preserve jars on the shelves. "I came to personally investigate the rumors that reached the court," he said. "Rumors about a French governess who supposedly had undue influence over this family." Marie felt herself pale, but the Count continued, "And I must say I found something very different from what I expected." Friedrich frowned. "Sir?" "I found," said the Count, accepting a cup of coffee that Marie offered him with trembling hands, "two healthy, happy children who speak 3 languages fluently and demonstrate knowledge of agriculture, cooking, and literature above average. I found a castle that functions like clockwork, administered with efficiency and care, and I found a prince who governs with justice and wisdom." The silence that followed was broken only by the tinkling of porcelain when the Count set down his cup. "Mademoiselle Dubois," he said, turning to Marie, "the sisters of the convent of Saint Teresa in Marseille wrote to me about you. They said you were one of their most brilliant pupils, that you learned not only cooking, but also mathematics, literature, and languages. They said you cared for the orphaned children with exceptional dedication." Marie looked at him with surprise. "Sir, the Emperor," continued the Count, "is less concerned with a governess's nationality than with her competence. And from the results I see here, you are exceptionally competent." Friedrich stepped forward. "Your Excellency, I don't understand." The Count smiled. "Baron von Steinbach represents a faction of the court that believes nobility is defined only by blood. I represent another faction, one that believes true nobility manifests in actions, in character, in the ability to elevate others." He approached Marie, who remained motionless as if witnessing a miracle. "Mademoiselle," he said formally but gently, "His Imperial Majesty has the pleasure of granting you the title of Baroness of Erlingen in recognition of the exceptional services rendered to this family and this principality." The world seemed to stop. Marie looked at Friedrich, who smiled as if the sun had risen within his chest. She looked at Heinrich and Greta, who clapped without fully understanding what was happening, but knowing it was something wonderful. "This means," she began, her voice just a whisper. "It means," said the Count, "that there are no longer impediments to a possible marriage between your ladyship and Prince Friedrich. It means that love and competence triumphed over prejudice and empty tradition." Epilogue: The Wedding and New Beginning. 3 months later, on a golden September morning, Marie Dubois, now Baroness of Erlingen, walked down the main corridor of the castle, wearing a white silk dress, simple but elegant, carrying a bouquet of roses from the very garden she had cultivated. Heinrich and Greta followed ahead of her, scattering flower petals on the path. Friedrich waited for her before the improvised altar in the main hall, his blue eyes shining with a happiness that seemed to radiate from him like light. When she reached his side, he took her hands, the same hands that had prepared his first tarte tatin, that had comforted wounded children, that had transformed a cold house into a welcoming home. "With you," he whispered as they exchanged vows before Father Wilhelm, "I learned that true love knows no boundaries of class, nationality, or convention. I learned that a family is built not with blood alone, but with care, dedication, and the courage to choose each other every day. Marie smiled through tears of joy. And I learned, she responded, that home isn't where we're born, but where we choose to plant our roots and make love flourish. When they kissed, sealing their union, Erlingen's bells began to ring, and the sound echoed throughout the principality like a celebration that sometimes, just sometimes, life's most beautiful stories surpass any fairy tale. Years later, when they told this story to the children who came after, Marie and Friedrich always ended the same way. And so we learned that true nobility isn't in the title we carry, but in the nobility of heart we choose to demonstrate each day. Love had triumphed, the castle was full of life again, and an orphan cook from Marseille had become not only Princess of Erlingen, but queen of a home where every meal was seasoned with love, and every day began with gratitude for having found their true family. Heinrich and Greta ran to hug their new parents, and for the first time since Margaret's death, Erlingen Castle again echoed with the laughter of a complete family.